If you're like me, you've been shocked at the last couple of years looking at the headlines of the number of pastors, ministry, and nonprofit leaders who have crashed, burned, been accused of sexual abuse, embezzlement, all kind of wrongdoing. Churches and ministries are struggling right now, and there's a real leadership problem. It's a crisis with a capital C. I wrote a book recently called Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. And on today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into that and talk about some of the big issues related to how we navigate, how we really guide our organization when a leader collapses, when it falls, when a crisis happens within or without. No matter what happens, there's a way through it. We're going to talk about that today. You know, we see headlines today about pastors failing, whether it's sexual accusations, whether it's embezzlement accusations, whether it's other issues. And also, we're seeing criticism from the outside. We're seeing cancel culture issues happen. We're seeing some cities are trying to take over church property for tax reasons. There's just all kinds of crisis situations happening in churches today. It could be insurance problems. Who knows? But the truth is, it's been going on for a long time. Early in my career as a producer and a filmmaker and a Christian communicator, I started getting calls from pastors or elder boards or executive pastors talking about their pastor or another leader in their church or another crisis they were happening. How do they navigate it? How do they deal with it? The truth is, ministry leaders are blindsided when these things happen. They don't teach them this stuff in seminary or Bible school. They don't talk about crisis communication, and it's a big, big issue. So I started responding and I started helping these churches and started working with them and helping them navigate these things. Now, I'm not an attorney. In fact, I often recommend that an attorney be your first call should a crisis happen. But I'm not a therapist or a counselor either. I'm a communicator. And there's an enormous amount to be said for communicating a crisis well. It's so important that you communicate throughout a crisis. In fact, it's interesting that recently, we've seen some major ministries, major churches in particular, really go through horrible criticism, not just because the sin of the leader, that's bad enough, the abusive situation, the sexual problems, whatever it was, that's bad enough. But then they also get an enormous amount of criticism because they did such a poor job of communicating to the congregation, to partners, donors, the general public. If we don't communicate through a crisis well, trust me, it will go very, very badly. So communicating is so important. So I dealt with so many churches over the years, helping kind of navigate these things. And let me tell you, this doesn't mean, trying to cover up anything. This is not about covering up anything. In fact, it's about really uncovering things. It's about letting the light in so we can see exactly the truth in the situation and help a church navigate through this. So I've helped so many do this that I finally put it into a book, Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Your Mission, and Your Reputation During a Crisis. I just poured all that experience, all those situations I've encountered into this book. And I'll tell you what, if you're a leader, I would encourage you need to have this on your desk. If you're a nonprofit leader, a ministry leader, a pastor, executive pastor, if you're a board member of any of these kind of organizations, hey, even if you're, a member of a church, get this for your leaders. Buy copies for your leaders. I've had a couple churches buy a case of books, 32 books, to give to their elders, to give to their staff. I had one denominational district in Ohio. They bought a case to give to all their local pastors in their district. They felt it was such important information that people needed to have. So I wanted to take a little bit of a dive. I can't go too deep. I do have the book. Plus, I have a masterclass. I would encourage you to check out the masterclass I've done online on the book that takes you in a much, much deeper dive. And if you're a visual learner, maybe the masterclass is for you. If you're an auditory learner, get the book. I love to read. I'm a reader, and so I love these kind of things. So get them. But let me go into some of the information that will give you some kind of an overview of how to, not just survive, but thrive when a crisis happens at your church. And let me give you, first of all, let's start with just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. Crisis, in my experience, crises come in two different directions. One is external. That means someone from the outside is pressuring you. It could be a lawsuit. Maybe a child broke their leg on the playground. Maybe you're getting sued by a vendor. Who knows what it could be? It could be a cancel culture protest. Maybe people in your community don't like what you're preaching. It could be a pro-abortion kind of a thing. Who knows what it is, but it's external. It comes from the outside. The second type of crises I encounter a lot is internal. That means it's most often, frankly, self-inflicted. That means, quite frankly, that somebody screwed up internally. It could be a pastor. It could be a youth director, a worship leader, another staff member. In one church, it was a janitor. It could be sexually abusive allegations. It could be financial allegations, embezzlement. Just to frame that, by the way, I saw one study recently that indicated as much as $1 billion a year is embezzled from churches across America. Now, let's just pause on that for a minute. Think of it, $1 billion a year is embezzled from churches across America. That takes your breath away. I mean, think of the work for the kingdom of God that could happen because of embezzlement. And yet, or because embezzlement happens, that kingdom work isn't happening. And here's the thing, it's just a matter of guardrails. These are churches that don't have proper guardrails in place to protect the church from that secretary who's handling the money, or the executive pastor who's handling the credit cards, or someone else on staff in the counting room, whatever it may be. Churches are seeing money just slipping away, and it adds up to $1 billion a year. That's really remarkable. So let me give you the top 5 reasons, by the way, that churches are sued. And so keep in mind, some of these are external, some of these are internal. We want to deal with both. It's important. But number 1 is sexual abuse of a minor. If you've seen headlines recently, you know that's not crazy. That's happening out there, and it's incredibly sad and frustrating, but it's happening more often than we think. The sexual abuse of a minor is the number 1 reason churches are sued. Number 2, property disputes. Very often churches will get into a property dispute with a business next door or in a community where they decide they don't want a church. It could be a million different reasons. Maybe it's a city encroachment of some kind. One church in California had bought property to expand, to go to a new location, and the city sued them to take over that land because they wanted to sell it to a big box store to make tax revenue from. So we're seeing a lot of more property disputes happening. Number 3 is personal injuries. Like I said, it could be a kid falling on the playground and breaking his leg. It's somebody falling down the steps at church. I mean, there's a myriad of reasons why people can get hurt, particularly if it's a large church and a lot of people are coming. The 4th is zoning issues. A lot of cities are changing their zoning rules, and a lot of churches aren't paying attention when they buy property and get the best advice, knowing what kind of zoning has been allocated for that property. You have to be careful. There's some places you can't build near. Maybe it's zoned for light industrial, or it's zoned for a community. I don't know. I'm not a zoning expert, but talk to a lawyer. It's incredibly important. And then the 5th reason churches are sued most often is insurance coverage disputes. There's a lot of insurance coverage issues. And, it's funny, in almost all of these areas, insurance is involved. And so insurance property and, insurance disputes of all kinds are a big, big thing with churches. So let me just say that here's some things I think that churches just need to be more aware of. Let me just start with that because I think it's really important. And that is, we need to be much more transparent in everything that we do. And I know transparency is a kind of a trendy word right now, and a lot of people use it, and they don't really understand what it means. But the truth is, churches of all organizations should be transparent. Our finances should be transparent. Our behavior, our morals, our attitudes, the rules of conduct. Now, it's interesting that when I was writing the book, there was a pastor in, I think it was Chicago, that had such a passion for integrity with his church and his team that when they remodeled the office space for the church staff, he put windows and doors in every single office in the building. He just felt like, look, I want to reduce I want to create obstacles for hanky-panky. I want to make sure nothing can get started. And it's interesting because, you can have all the privacy you want behind glass. In fact, he so impressed me. That idea so impressed me when we remodeled our office years ago in Burbank. I decided to do the very same thing, and we put glass windows. Very cool. We had a very hip office. They were chicken wire windows. They were very cool, and glass doors in every room. We even put a glass door in the conference room. I mean, it wasn't a glass door. We made the whole wall glass. We just want to make sure no hanky-panky can go on. And I think there's something to be said for that. And I'll tell you, it's cheap, cheap, cheap to go to Home Depot and buy a glass door and put it in the offices at your church. There's a lot of controversy lately about what's called the Billy Graham rule. And it's really not the Billy Graham rule. It's called the Modesto Manifesto. And it's a part of that. The Modesto Manifesto was a code of conduct Billy Graham and his team put together when they were in Modesto, California, very early in Billy's preaching career, that they wanted to have the highest levels of accountability and honesty and transparency on their team. So they put together a whole series of rules. And one of those rules was that you couldn't be alone with a member of the opposite sex in an office behind a closed door. And Billy solved the problem in those days by leaving the door open. If he met with a woman without someone else present, he would leave the office door open and his secretary was sitting outside. Well, that's fine, but that causes a lot of issues because number one, it means if it's a male pastor, that means males on the staff can have private meetings with a pastor, but women can't. And so it's understandably gotten a lot of criticism over the last number of years. It's true in businesses, nonprofits as well. But you know what? Glass windows, glass doors solve the problem. You can have private meetings with members of the opposite sex behind glass. People can walk by and see what's going on. You can have privacy. They can't hear the conversation. So just little things like that can make such a dramatic difference. Transparency comes at all levels, not just financial transparency, but physical transparency. Seeing through glass windows and doors is a remarkable thing. So little things like that. I think the theme here is create as many obstacles as you can for people to mess up. We want to nip this stuff in the bud. We're all fallen creatures. That doesn't excuse anybody. And people should suffer. Justice needs to happen in these cases. But we want to stop it. We don't want it to happen in the first place. So whatever you can do to help create an environment where people just can't do the wrong thing is just a remarkable thing. And I encourage you to do it. Another thing to think about is if a crisis happens at your organization, whatever you do, don't cover it up. Be honest. Be upfront. It doesn't mean you have to tell lurid details, and it means you have to be honest with what you know at the time, at the beginning of a crisis. You don't know everything. You don't know all that's going on, but I would encourage you, always be honest. So often we feel like, we're protecting the church, we're protecting a family, we're protecting the nonprofit. If we just kind of cover this part up or don't bring this other stuff to light. But the truth is it will always come back and bite you. It's always a bad issue if you come back and do that. It's just important to remember, I think the three things are never cover anything up, share what you know at the time, be honest and forthright, and no matter who you're protecting, you're not protecting. And it's important that you get the truth out there. I think another thing to think of is if there's a victim, if it's an internal situation, particularly a sexually abusive situation, look out for the victim immediately. Very often we just dismiss the victim in the way we respond to a crisis situation because we think, well, this could not be true of pastor. This allegation could not be true of pastor, or I've known this leader, our worship leader, for years and years and years, and this sexual allegation couldn't possibly be true. And they kind of tend to dismiss the victim. And very often we've seen, in fact, recently we've seen a couple of very high-profile cases in the church and ministry world where a victim made allegations against a pastor or a ministry leader. And it was so shocking, people couldn't believe it. They not only dismissed that victim, they ridiculed that victim. Staff members ridiculed that victim, made fun of her, only to find out weeks or months later that she was exactly right. And it was so humiliating, so embarrassing. Those staff members were forced to resign. Board members were forced to resign because they did something similar. So you don't know what's going on in a crisis. And I think we've seen in the last few years that it can happen to the most trusted, what we feel like are the most trusted people in the country, Christian leaders in the country. So it doesn't mean every allegation is true. There are certainly false allegations, but my advice is at least take them seriously. If the victim needs counseling, provide it. Seek help for that victim. Help them get the kind of help they need to get through this. Don't never, ever dismiss them. Take them seriously. It's so very, very important. Because let me tell you, being a victim of sexual abuse, for instance, can destroy their life. It can really damage their life for a very long time, if not forever. So it's important to remember we need to, as the church, be much more responsive to sexual abuse situations. It's very, very important. Another thing I would say is safeguard your email, text messaging behavior. It's very interesting the number of leaders I've seen forced to step down because of things they said in an email or things they said in a text message. I know one pastor received a joke from a woman in the congregation. It wasn't, it was a little edgy. It wasn't a lurid, sexually explicit joke or anything, but it was a little on the edge. And so he thought he'd one up her and send her another one back. And she printed it out, took it to her board and said, look, this is the kind of stuff your pastor is sending to us congregation members. And that pastor was fired that afternoon. So I would just encourage you, be careful. Email, I know Google has said that when you delete an email, it's not really deleted on their servers. You may delete it from your computer, but it's not deleted from their servers. And I don't know about other platforms. They may be similar, but the truth is I would consider email something that's never deleted. You can delete your text messages. You can delete your emails. You can delete your browser history, but I have a feeling there's a record still out there somewhere. And it's interesting because in a court case, these kind of things magically reappear. Have you ever noticed that in a lawsuit, suddenly text messages that people thought they deleted show up? Emails, it's the same way with emails. So just think about your behavior. I would just encourage you. And if you get an email that may be sexually explicit or even just kind of edgy, you're not sure, I would encourage you, don't even respond. In fact, share it with your assistant, share it with another trusted leader at your organization, and get advice from them. One of the things that we've discovered is if someone's after, coming onto you sexually through email, even a negative response will encourage them. Same way with trolls. If somebody's just trolling you, they're just being a jerk and they're nasty and they have your email address and they're just sending you nasty emails, even asking them to stop or, that encourages them. So I encourage you, don't even do anything. I have I'm not a church, and I have 2 or 3 people in my office that have access to my email, can see my text messages. And I think that's really vital. I want to be as transparent as possible. When I come in from a project, I give my receipts to my assistant who organizes them, gives them to a producer who goes through them, then gives them to our CPA who goes through them. So there's not a lot of way I could be using company money in an inappropriate manner. But the thing about emails is interesting. I spoke at a big media conference in South Africa years ago, and a month or so later, I got an email, very, very explicit email from a woman who was very beautiful. I know because she included photos in her email. And it wasn't sexual. It was just, man, I'd love to spend more time with you. I'd love to learn from you. I'd love to be mentored by you. It was just a little icky. And so because my assistant sees all my emails as well, I said, look, why don't you respond to the gal? And so it's funny, she did. And the minute that woman in South Africa realized my female assistant sees all my emails, we never heard from her again. So email can get you in trouble in a very quick way. Text messaging. I would say this, and just closing this little segment, don't fire anybody through an email. Don't criticize people through an email. The thing to remember here about email is the minute you hit send, you've lost control of that email. And, that guy you're sending it to may be your friend today, but he may not be your friend next year. And guess what? He has that email. I learned a lesson from my financial advisor years ago. I would call him and ask him a financial question or a tax question, and he would say, give me a call, we'll talk about it. It was always on the phone. He would never do it through an email because he knew there were people that can have access to email. And if you wanted to be a private thing, pick up the phone and call, or better yet, do it face to face. So just something about email and social media we need to think about. Another thing is vetting employees. One of the things I think we don't do well enough in church and ministry today is vet employees. We're Christians. We want to think the best of everybody. We want to feel like, okay, well, Sam over here recommended him, so he must be pretty good. But I cannot tell you the number of hires that have gone sour pretty quickly simply because they did not do enough vetting. I remember there's a really famous church. I won't call their name. That's famous for worship, high-end music. They do great television, really high-end. And one of their television producers left that church and was hired by a church that I was working with a few years ago. And they were excited. They said, "Oh, he comes from this such and such church, and he's he's amazing. He must be amazing." Well, all it took was a phone call from me to that church, because I have friends at that big church. I called that church and said, "Why is he not working with you anymore?" And they said, "Because we fired him. He's no good. He's terrible at what he does." And he parlayed that into this reputation as I work for those guys, so I'm amazing. And this church hired him without vetting him a bit, without calling his references, without anything. So let me tell you, you could stop a lot of grief, and not to mention embezzlement issues, sexual abuse issues, all kind of things, if you just look at people's backgrounds. Have a background check done on every employee. You know what? In an age where we're doing kids ministry and youth ministry at churches, you can't afford to come up short here. That's very important. We need to vet people. It's more important than ever. I just think we need to hire people based on character more than ability. I've always said with our team at Cooke Media Group, rather have a team that has incredible character, has incredible integrity, works well together, the chemistry is amazing, than a team who is even better technically in what they do. You know, I think if you have a team that works well together, that has integrity, that has character, they're going to do something amazing. So think about how you're hiring and why you're hiring. And how, you know, it's funny. I grew up in church. My dad was a pastor, so I get this more than most people. But, you know, we often think, well, let's hire Bob. He showed up as a volunteer twice. So, you know, he could be our marketing director. He worked at Gap one year as a salesperson. So, and we hire him without really looking very deep into what Bob's capable of doing or not capable of doing and what his past is all about. So just think about it. I know getting people to work at a church sometimes is difficult, but it's worth going through it. I wish, you know, the joke is that we hire quickly and fire slowly at churches. Let's flip that. Let's hire slowly. And then if we find out somebody doesn't work for any reason, let's move them on. Doesn't mean we kick them to the curb. You know, let's help them to get plugged into a place where they could do great work. But if they're not the right mix for your church or your ministry, let's move them on quickly. It doesn't help to keep them around. It really kills morale. And the last thing I'd say in this little section here is about the sex offender database. Since we're talking about vetting people, let me say this about the sex offender database. And by the way, you can access it online. It's free. You can go online. You can actually do a zip code search and see who the people are in your neighborhood. And maybe it was because I spent 35 years living in Los Angeles. There were a lot of them in my neighborhood. I was shocked when I went on to see how many people had been convicted and were on the sexual offender registry. But here's the thing to think about with that. It's a wide range. It's a big pot, which means it goes all the way from that old guy that's a hardcore predator looking for kids to have, you know, relationships with, all the way to two young high school lovers who decided to have a sexual relationship. And the minute one of them became 18 and the other one is a year earlier or a year younger, that 18-year-old became a predator and went on the sex registry list. That doesn't excuse that kind of behavior, but it does mean the motivations aren't the same. You have some people that are stalking kids. You have other people that just got on it because they were young lovers and they decided to get sexually involved too soon, and they ended up on the sexual registry list. So we have to think about those things. And they're because people that are, if they haven't already, in fact, I bet they have, people are going to start coming to your church who are on the sex offender registry. Now, what do we do about those people? Obviously, we want Jesus to change their life. So we want to invite them. We want them to come. However, there does need to be boundaries. I remember a church in the Midwest when I was writing the book. There was a couple very alert ushers, and they noticed there was a young guy, a visitor to their church one Sunday, and a very amiable guy, a very nice fella, but he was really staring down kids. He was really looking at the kids a lot. I mean, really eyeballing kids. And they got a little concerned. So they went over, met him, introduced themselves, got his name, went back to the church office, ran a check on the registry, and sure enough, he was on the sex offender registry. And so they had to have that conversation with him about, hey, we're thrilled that you're coming to church, but we need to have a conversation about where the boundaries are. So let me tell you, this is something to be said for training your team. This is something that every member of your team needs to know and be aware of. Doesn't mean we become behavior cops. You can destroy lives through false accusations, but I do think we need to be more aware of red flags. And you could take my book as a textbook and really talk to your team about it. I think go through this with your team, because the key here is when we're aware of red flags, we see things that could potentially be stopped long before they ever happen. You know, that youth leader that's spending a little too much time with one young girl from the youth group. Maybe someone else on the team that's just showing up late every day, which strangely looks like a hangover. Any number of things that just by being aware. Now, it doesn't mean, like I say, you don't become a behavior cop. You don't start broadcasting it to everybody. And you don't even necessarily confront them, but I would go to a senior leader at the church or ministry and say, I'm just noticing this about Susan or about Sam or about Bob. And I think we should talk to them about it. And boy, I tell you, so many crisis situations have been averted simply because people were aware of red flags going on. And I think that's really, really important. So let me kind of wrap this up with just a word about a crisis plan. Having a plan in place. When a number of studies indicate that when you have a crisis plan in place, you always come out better on the other end. And so I encourage people to have a plan in place. Let me give you 5 or 6 quick thoughts to think about when it comes to having a plan in place. Number 1, ask these critical questions. Where are we vulnerable? Maybe you're an inner city church and you need a taller fence. Maybe you're an older church and you need to update the physical structure of some things to keep accidents from happening or keep predators outside. Maybe you need to update security. You know what? As a church, we think, we really shouldn't need security, but in this day and age we live in, we do. And that's not just security officers. It's often lighting, those kind of sound detectors, things like that. Are our insurance policies up to date? That's another big issue. I've seen churches that collapsed during a crisis because their insurance policies had lapsed and they couldn't handle the legal bills to help them through the crisis. So that's an important thing. Are we vetting employees? We've talked about that. That's an important question to be asking. Do we have a good attorney? As I said earlier on, I say an attorney should be your first call. And so I would encourage you to get an attorney that has crisis experience. It's not the same as, an attorney that's an expert at contracts or an attorney that's expert at hiring or firing. Getting someone that has some level of crisis experience is critically important. And while I'm on that subject, let me say you should also consider having a communications person on call. As I said earlier on, many of these crises get worse, but not just because of the initial sin or screw ups or mistakes or accidents, whatever it was, but they get so much worse because they're not communicated well. And I'll tell you, when you communicate during a crisis, it's important that you're honest, you're forthright with the congregation or the donors, and you not just tell them what happened, but let them know what you're doing to assure them it's not happening again. What guardrails are you putting in place to make sure this doesn't happen again? What changes are you making in your structure, your organization, your physical plant, whatever? That's important. They need to know that changes are being made so they can feel comfortable and safe at the church. I would also say, so by the way, communicating matters. Communicating matters. And so have a communications person on standby. Remember, for all practical purposes, an attorney's job is to keep you out of jail, but his job isn't necessarily to save your reputation. A communication professional person can help a church's reputation remain intact. I don't want to see a church crash and burn because of the screw up, the mistake, the sin of one person. Let's deal with that person. Let's get justice for the victim if there is one. Let's get this guy apprehended if necessary or reported to the authorities if necessary, and then deal with it. But a communication person, dealing with those things well will help you with your reputation and help you move forward. And I would also say one last little thing about reporting to authorities. In the early days, when my dad was pastor, for instance, back in the 40s or 50s or 60s, there were either no reporting laws or they were just being made. They were murky. They were just being put together. Every state was a little bit different. And so as a result, pastors didn't know what to do if there was a minor involved, if there was a sexually abusive situation. And by the way, it's always abusive if a minor's involved. Also, for the record, it's also abusive if an employee is involved or a church member is involved. Keep in mind, we consider sexual abuse something when the power dynamic is unequal. In other words, when it's out, if it's two people that just meet randomly, that's one thing. It's bad enough, of course. That's one thing. But if it's a pastor who has authority over a staff member, that's going to be an abusive situation. If it's a pastor who's highly esteemed by a church member, that's going to be an abusive situation. You see this on college campuses a lot with a professor and a student. That's an abusive situation. But for years, it wasn't reported. And very often, it was the family that if it was a minor, it was the family that kept it from being reported. Very often, they would say, look, we don't want Johnny to have to change schools. We don't want to have to move. Let's just keep this quiet under the rug, deal with the guy, deal with the woman, whatever the abusive person was, deal with them, and let's just keep it quiet. Well, you don't have that option now. Whether the family wants to or not, if a minor's involved, it has to be reported. And a good attorney will know what authorities in your state or in your community need to be alerted. You need to report it immediately. In fact, even if if you're a leader in the organization and you had an abusive sexual situation going on with a staff member, the staff member was having an abusive situation with a minor, even not reporting that, you can be prosecuted, even though you had nothing to do with it. This is serious. So it always needs to be reported immediately. As soon as you find out, you need to report it. It's so very important. It doesn't matter what the family thinks anymore. It's just across the board needs to be reported. And I think that's really critically important. Things can't be swept under the rug. Things can't be hidden. They certainly shouldn't be. And so it's important to understand that power dynamic, because so many people out there just don't get the fact that if it's a sexual relationship with an employee, that's abusive. If it's a sexual relationship with a church member and you're the pastor, that's abusive. That power dynamic really does matter. So think about that. So, I could go on forever, but the fact is, I have to say, this book, it's gotten great reviews. It's got some amazing endorsements in the front by very influential pastors, ministry leaders, others. And I just encourage you, take the time to get it, go through it, or take the Masterclass I have online, go through it, and sit down with your team. They need to know this information because I'll tell you, we just live in a world where it's so easy. In today's social media world, it's so easy to say the wrong thing, to do the wrong thing, for a young person to get all inflamed with passion or thinks he or she is in love with somebody and do something inappropriate. It's going to happen. I always say it's not if a crisis will happen, it's when. And that's nothing, that's not saying God can't get you through these things. And I believe he can, but we have to be ready. God expects us to have a plan and be ready for it should something happen. And I think hopefully you've seen enough in the headlines in the last few years that this is serious. This is serious, and we need to respond in an appropriate way when these kind of horrible, horrible things happen. And again, I say, sometimes we get hung up on the sexual abuse situations, and there's far too many of those, of course, but we often forget that crises can come from all directions. As I said, lawsuits, cancel culture, critics, social media critics. I know great churches in America that have somebody that's taken out a blog to do nothing but criticize them, or taken out a Facebook page. These are often disgruntled ex-employees or disgruntled ex-church members, and all they do is criticize the church. And so the public sees it, and it creates problems for that church. So I just encourage you, we need to be ready. Hopefully, we want to pray and believe God that a crisis won't happen in our church, but we need to be ready if it does. I think it's important. So get the book, go through the Masterclass, get multiple copies, go through it with your team. I think it could be the smartest thing you could do, and it could really save you an enormous amount of grief and frustration and heartache down the road. It's a tough subject. This is a tough subject, and this has not been the most exciting podcast episode I've ever done. And I've spoken about this to numerous pastor conferences and church conferences, and it's always difficult. because, there's a quiet in the room when I talk about these things, but they know we need to know this information. It's just important. So yeah, as a media producer, it's not the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life, but it's so important. If we can save somebody from being victimized, if we can save a church going through the trauma of a crisis, if we can save a church from closing, a ministry from shutting down, I think it's more than worth it. So get the book and stay tuned. Stay with us. This podcast is going to cover this covers a lot of subjects, not just this, but I think this is incredibly important. And I hope you pay attention. And please, I encourage you, get the book. It could make a huge difference in your church or ministry.